Welcome back to the program. With me now from DPG Advisory, a former Liberal advisor, David Gazzard, and Ben Oaquist, a former Greens advisor, now Executive Director at the Australia Institute. Gentlemen, great to see you both. Lots of news happening today at the state political level. First of all, the IBAC findings in Melbourne. Egregious, extensive misconduct among Victorian Labor MPs. The Premier says there's no finding in relation to him. He's apologised because it's happened on his watch. How does this play out, an election looming in November?
I think it's diabolical for an election in November. And remember that the terms of the inquiry were quite compressed, right, and quite constrained. So if you're the Premier, you're now looking at a revitalised opposition that will be saying, well, look, we need to go further than this. The IBAC's come back with quite scarifying findings, but it notes in there that it doesn't have the scope to go further, and it probably needs to go further. So where's that go, right, in the last few months before an election? It's a terrible situation to be kept.
Yeah, it's interesting. The language that was used by the Commissioner says, well, first of all, that no criminal charges will be recommended, but the difficulties in proof and the state of the law are such that we cannot recommend prosecution. So it doesn't sound like the Commissioner was opposed to going down that path, but simply the law wasn't sufficient enough to allow him to do that.
Yeah, this kind of integrity agenda is sweeping politics at federal and state level. You know, DOM was a big part of the federal election campaign, and now I've got the push for a federal ICAC. At state level, you know, corruption findings in New South Wales today and further revelations over the Barilaro scandal and this kind of damning report out of Victoria are all showing that politics needs a clean-up. And it's important because, you know, politics is important. You know, politics gets a really bad rap and a really bad name, but politics should be a force for good. It's a necessary part of democracy. Without politics, you can't have democracy. Without democracy, you can't have politics. You need both. If you believe in democracy, you believe in politics. But if we keep running it down like this, people lose faith not just in politics, but in democracy. So this integrity agenda is important to help fix politics, and we've got to do a better job at showing that politics can be good, but that's held back by revelations like this. Having said that, going back to the bigger picture and the kind of branch stacking scandal, I think the real problem is, of course, is that people aren't joining and engaging with politics enough, and the levels of people involved at a grassroots level are much smaller than they used to be, so branch stacking is more possible. If you have a lot of people involved, like there used to be, branch stacking becomes impossible, and that's the root cause we need to address, and that's about making people believe in the force of good of politics again.
On to another matter, the RBA review to be undertaken by 3 experts, 1 international, 2 local. The Treasurer says he wants it back by March of next year. This is an area where there appears to be quite a strong level of bipartisanship too, David.
Yeah, I think it's right, and the push for this sort of started under Josh Frydenberg, and you were starting to see things like financial services, new regulation for financial services being hived off to Treasury to manage. You know, things like buy now, pay later, some of the newer forms of conducting business, where there were new technologies involved. And the RBA, I mean, no fault of the RBA, it just hasn't kept track with the really detailed, serious levels of regulation that are required. It manages, you know, your standard stuff through the arteries of normal commerce, right? That and some of the other regulatory agencies that have control of that, with APRA and so on and so forth. So really needed to be freshened up. I think both sides have said, hey, we want to attract as much new business here as possible. We don't want it excluded by the old regulatory measures. So there's clearly place for reform in that sector to try to encourage, you know, crypto exchanges, for instance, here, new forms of payment. You want those here. You don't want to exclude those to other jurisdictions, but the regulations have to keep pace with the technology.
And in many respects, they've been behind the game, certainly on inflation and rates. And there hasn't been a review in its modern iteration for certainly 30 years since it's targeted the inflation mandate, and then you go back to 40 years since the central bank's there's been a review. It's a long time between drinks.
Yeah, and I think that's the fundamental thing. That inflation targeting regime of the RBA that's not in the legislation. What's in the legislation for the RBA Act is full employment. And yet, really, it seems to be de facto targeting inflation, not full employment. I think that's what we need the bigger debate about. Full employment, what it means, how to get there, how come that's in the Act and inflation targeting is not. And what about some more diversity on the board? Bernie Fraser's spoken strongly about getting a workers' representative or somebody from that section of society, not just sections of the business community. A more balanced RBA would be good.
Ben Oquist, David Gazzard, gentlemen, great to see you both. Thanks.
Thanks, Graham.